Nearly half of the world's population has voted or is about to vote this year. Some are even calling 2024 a mega election year. One of the biggest challenges we face in these elections is disinformation. Good evening. My name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the Anatomy of Disinformation. All over the world, bad actors are deploying all kinds of disinformation narratives to polarize our societies and undermine our trust in the electoral process. Civil society organizations, experts, and government institutions are hard at work trying to counter these efforts. Today, we'll talk about some of the tactics and techniques being used to attack our elections and what we can do to keep them secure. From India to Poland and from the UK to Germany, voters were mobilized this year to cast their ballots and make their decision in the voting booth. For some, that choice may have been influenced by covert actors. Our first guest, Rachele Gilman, is here to explain how disinformation campaigns can affect how we cast our votes.
Rachele Gilman, Director of Intelligence, Global Disinformation Index. Director of Intelligence at the Global Disinformation Index, GDI, leading strategic efforts to counteract online harm and disinformation. Former intelligence analyst with extensive experience at Tadaweb, New Knowledge, and the US Department of Defense. Specialist in computational disinformation analysis and multidisciplinary intelligence methodologies for threat assessment.
Rachele, welcome and thank you for joining us from London. You've been working on elections this year that has been called a mega election year. Have you seen anything unusual in terms of disinformation in Europe and America?
Thank you for having me. Elections of the century, huh? Yes, there's been quite a lot of disinformation across Europe and in the United States and even beyond into other places as well.
Do you think that we are ready? Do you think that we are ready for it? Because we knew that there is so much elections coming up, right, for already several years.
Well, this is the problem with fighting disinformation, isn't it? That some of the ongoing issues that we face as civil society organizations, as governments, as private industry, trying to counter is that we're always reacting, and it's been really difficult for us to be proactive. And so despite that we knew these elections were coming, we still, I would say right up until 3 or 4 days prior to the EU elections, we were still in a reactive mode. And I do think that we learned some lessons and we're trying to take proactive steps from that point forward and in these next upcoming elections in the second half of the year. But it's something that all of us need to consider as we move forward, that this can't be a reactive battle, right? We always have to be taking those proactive steps.
Very much so, but what are the tactics, techniques, and procedures that you've seen as well by the bad actors that were trying to interference in the elections so far?
So the two main things that I've seen across all countries and all are two different types of narratives. And those narratives are approached through lots of different tactics. So I'm going to start with the narratives and then tell you some of the tactics that we saw behind that. So the narratives include things like social division. How do I amplify social division, whether it's small boat immigration in the UK or anti-immigration rhetoric across Europe, or similar anti-immigration rhetoric in the US. So that's the first type of narrative. And the second type of narrative is undermining civic integrity. How do we drive a wedge between voters and their belief in the candidates that they have, the governments that they have, and the processes that are in place to keep elections secure?
And have you seen that elections were, or those interference were different in the different countries, depending whether it was France, Germany, UK, or the EU elections European-wide? And what we're seeing right now in the US, do you see that they are different, or they are rather like very much having the same ground?
So those two themes are pretty common throughout all spaces, whether we're talking about the country, the specific election, or how they're being used. So I think that sometimes the tactics to get at those two things can change. So we may see that in some elections and some countries, the use of AI might be greater, or flooding the infosphere with certain types of narratives or websites or social media posts might be greater. We also see in some places that buying up lots of ads to promote things that are disinforming is greater in some places than others. But we did see some.
Can you give me like the example maybe of it? I don't know, like France was holding the elections pretty much during the Olympics, right? They were very close to each other. Have you seen any specific interference or disinformation regarding this issue that was trying to interference within the elections, for example?
Yeah, so in this particular case, in the case of France, we saw quite a lot of undermining the government, the current government, and undermining any sort of coalition that could take place outside of parties that were favored by countries that are involved in foreign influence. So we saw a lot of things that were designed to make Macron seem as if he was part of a very specific global elite, part of a cabal. There was a lot of use of anti-Semitism, anti-religion, and the idea that he was pro-Great Replacement theory. So the idea that any sort of government that involved Macron or people who were willing to work with him would end in the dissolution of France as we know it, because they would allow immigrants and Muslims to take over a predominantly culturally white and Christian nation.
So very much based on the same area as QAnon was, right, or still is, and that was used in the attack for the Capitol. What do you expect in November to happen, by the way? From the disinformation perspective, I'm not saying give me the shutout who's going to win, but rather what may happen in terms of disinformation in the campaign and further.
So I think that we already see quite a build-up to being able. Let me rephrase that. We have seen consistently from 2016 through till now rhetoric around the election process not being safe, ideas that there are ballot mules and that voting by mail should be illegal because there's a lot of fraud, or that people are fraudulently changing votes. In fact, that companies that own voting machines are actually changing votes. And all of this is designed to, one, make voters insecure about the process. And I think it's really important to think about this because it goes beyond fear and it drives people to apathy, right? Fear is something I think that we can sometimes counter with a little bit more ease. But when populations become apathetic when they think that there's no way to change because everything is rigged, how do we ever bring those people back into the system? How do we re-enfranchise those voters?
Rachel, thank you so much. I think it's a super important topic that you are saying, right? It's also about trust and the security of the vote and people willing to go and vote, and that's being diminished. Thank you for your work and for our discussion today. All the best. One of the most impactful elections of the year is rapidly approaching. US voters head to the polls on November 5th. So far, we've seen a campaign full of twists and turns, deepfakes, disinformation, and targeted narratives. Let's take a look how deepfakes are present in our information space.
A deepfake is a type of video or image or audio that is made to look like someone or made to look like someone did something that they didn't actually do using their likeness. There's a fine line between deepfake and Photoshop, or superimposing someone onto, another image. But a deepfake is a little bit harder to detect. It actually makes you look like you're doing that thing. It's another tool in the arsenal. What makes them a little bit more useful is the way that they can be catered and targeted to very specific audiences. So we see in mis and disinformation in general, a lot of hyper-targeting using the ranking and authority systems of different platforms based on the data and the action somebody takes to actually get the content that they see in that feed. Deepfakes are being used now to get to the top of a feed, undermining those ranking and authority systems and impersonating different influencers, candidates, officials that person might actually look to or want to gain information from in order to make their decision about who to vote for.
They have one problem. You know what the problem is? They have MAGA people outside screaming, "We love Trump, we love Trump, we love Trump."
This weird obsession with crowd sizes.
I knew Putin, I knew him well. And you know, he endorsed, I don't know if you saw the other day, he endorsed Kamala.
Her laugh is so expressive and infectious.
He endorsed Kamala. I was very offended by that.
There is an aspect to undermining confidence or creating an air of disrespect around that person, whatever they might be doing. And if you see that enough times, you start to associate it with that person. It also plays into bias that already exists. It's really hard to change somebody's opinion from right to left, but you can push it to be more extreme. Recently, there were a couple of deepfakes dropped of Trump and Elon Musk, I think, robbing someone. There was one with Trump with a gun. You know, you have Elon Musk, he's got disheveled hair and like a fake mugshot of him. And you look at it and you go, that's a deep fake, that's funny. There's also the robocalls of President Biden that went out recently.
A bunch of malarkey. We know the value of voting Democratic when our votes count. It's important that you save your vote for the November election.
It could have a deep psychological impact. If someone were to misuse a deep fake of somebody that I respect or look up to in a disrespectful way, it's kind of like, what is the boundary? What is off limits? And either it gives, for some people, it might give you permission to do it more to more people. Oh, well, this was done of this person, so now I can do it of this person because they matter less.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time. You see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but Someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele.
A lot of the votes in this mega election year are already over. But the most important one, in terms of its geopolitical impact, is yet to come. Americans will choose their new officials in early November. Our next guest, Benjamin Zeeb, is here to talk about elections interference.
Benjamin Zeeb, Head of Partnerships and co-founder at Alliance for Europe. In 2009, he witnessed the early stages of the ongoing European crisis as an Erasmus student in Madrid, convinced that a full federal union is the only solution to Europe's problems. In 2018, he co-founded Alliance for Europe and is now head of partnership. He is the co-author of Europa am Abgrund.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to talk with you about elections and disinformation. This show is talking about disinformation as such, and you are working with countering disinformation for quite some time already. This year, it's been, and it is, mega election year when half of population is going to vote or have been voted already. You specifically focus on Europe, and I would like to ask you what you've seen so far in terms of election interference.
Well, thank you very much, Maia, for having me on. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Well, it's been an exceptional year for elections, as you have said. And with so much at stake globally, it's of no surprise that there have been massive interference operations running in the elections that we have seen so far, be it in France, be it in the UK. And we are going to have to expect the same to come up in the US context as well.
And you are from Germany, that you've also been holding some of the elections this year. What have you been seeing in particular in your country?
Absolutely. So we have seen state elections, especially in the east of Germany, and those resulted in massive wins by far right and far left parties. I've recently spoken to a former foreign minister of Germany who categorized this as a clear win for Mr. Putin. And, you know, it's no surprise that Russia had a hand, at least in shaping the information environment ahead of the state elections in Germany. So we saw a massive amplification of anti-Western and pro-Russian narratives across all platforms. We saw a resurgence of the already known Doppelganger disinformation campaign, where essentially disinformers are copying well-established and well-known media outlets like Der Spiegel or Süddeutsche Zeitung or Die Zeit, and then putting disinformation narratives into that trusted format in order to confuse the population and to really change the political discourse.
Doppelganger indeed is a very interesting example, and it's very visible in Poland as well. It's been very much interfering in the Polish elections as well. And most of the things that we are talking, right, is about checking what can we do, what is happening with those that are spreading disinformation, with the bad actors that are affecting our elections. And we are reactive all the time, right? Checking, looking at what is happening, but what we can do to be more active.
Well, essentially, disinformation is a problem that hits all of society, and it requires an all of society response. That means at different instances, often disinformation campaign, be it in the planning stage or in the execution stage, we need different actors to be able to counter these attacks. That means we need universities on board, we need intelligence services on board, we need governments and regulators on board, we need communicators on board. So what we are trying to do is essentially to take a cybersecurity approach to disinformation, bring all of these different actors in the same room and then try to help to coordinate what the adequate response has to be at the precisely right moment. So it's not just about checking some facts, writing a report, and then 3 months later you know what's happening or what happened after the fact. What we really need is real-time analysis, very, very quick turnover of the results of these reports or of these inquiries, and then very, very quick responses. Sometimes this is easier and sometimes it's harder. If we, for example, see that an entity that is doing the disinforming is already sanctioned, like, for example, in the context of the French elections, we saw a massive Russia Today interference. So there were still a lot of Russia Today accounts, especially in Spain, still online and still spreading disinformation. So we were able to quickly react and take down an entire network of those that had reached more than 5 million people. And it was fairly easy to do so because sanctions mean they cannot legally operate and platforms have to shut them down very quickly.
And what are you doing? Are you cooperating with some of the institutions as such when you're looking and seeing some of the interference? Are you going directly to the platforms? Are you going directly to the institutions and they support you to go to platforms and platforms can take it down?
Absolutely. So we are operating partly as a member of the European ISAC, which is convened by the European External Action Service. And we are one of the conveners of the Counter Disinfo Network, which has more than 130 disinformation analysts and disinformation fighters sort of loosely assembled. So we're trying to muster those resources and put them into the service of what is already there in the ecosystem, which includes large institutions, which also includes certain governments and civil society organizations. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here, but rather plug our work into the existing efforts underway to counter this really fundamental threat.
And be very much part of the whole of the society approach, right? What do you think could support you more in the work that you are doing?
Well, I do think it's absolutely a question of resources. So if you compare it to cyber threats, we are in a situation where companies are already sort of calculating the costs of fighting cybercrime into their budget lines because they can see, okay, we were ransomed for X amount in the previous year, so we're just calculating a certain amount of costs in. But if you look at large reports, and what they say is that actually disinformation is a potentially larger and also economically more problematic threat than cyber in many ways. Yet nobody has really quantified the damages to companies' bottom lines or to democracy in a very similar way. So what we need apart from resources is just greater awareness that this is a very tangible threat. It's a very concrete issue with very organized and strategically savvy people executing strategies that are aimed at disrupting not just our democratic systems, but also business models and entire sectors across the West.
So there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of changing the system, actually, right? And I have a last question to you. Do you think that the politicians are already doing enough, or there should be more pressure on them?
I'm not one for sort of putting all politicians in one basket, but by and large and generally, yes, politicians are far away from taking the threat as seriously as it is. And where they are taking it seriously, they are sort of treating it like an externality, like, bad weather or stuff that just simply happens. Or they draw false analogies to sort of the old media environment they are still used to, and where bad press is just bad press, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense to fuss about it. But
Benjamin,
disinformation is not bad press. It's really
it's harmful, right?
A very, very different animal.
It's very much harmful and affecting our attitudes, changing our votes and behaviors. Thank you so much for joining us and for this discussion. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. Okay, so now let's sum up today's episode.
What is electoral interference? Electoral interference is an attempt or act aiming to disrupt or influence electoral processes. While the term is often used in reference to actions by state agents, many non-state actors such as criminal organizations and proxies may also engage in electoral interference in order to spread disinformation anonymously to a wider audience.
Thank you for joining us. As we've seen, disinformation can impact our decisions at the ballot box. So it's important to be resilient. Next week, we'll go deeper into the connection between disinformation and democracy. And until then, keep calm and think deeply.